In today's first reading from the book of Deuteronomy, we're coming to the conclusion of the story of Moses and the conclusion of the story of the Exodus, where Moses is telling the people, giving a kind of farewell speech about everything that they should do and say. And he says, I am now 120 years old, and I'm no longer able to move about freely. Besides, the Lord has told me that I shall not cross this Jordan. Moses is passing on his authority to Joshua. Joshua is going to lead the people now, not Moses. And Moses has seen the promised land, but he's not going to enter this promised land. And this text seems to suggest it's because he's just pretty old. Other texts seem to suggest it's a kind of punishment for disobedience by Moses or disobedience by the people as a whole. But however we begin to explain it, the reality is that this goal, this hope that Moses has held in his heart and led the people to all the way through is not going to be his to enjoy. And that raises two things that I think are important perhaps for us to think about, not just to understand this history, but to understand ourselves today in relationship to God and in relationship to the reign of God. The first is that he's giving authority to Joshua, but there's a way in which Moses' stepping back allows God to become front and center. Moses is not God. Moses is one of God's human servants, a very important one, obviously. But the next sentence, after saying that he will not cross the Jordan, our text says, it is the Lord your God who will cross before you. So it sort of says, however important Moses was, however great of a leader he was, God is the one who's in charge here. God is the one who is doing this. One of my favorite stories about Pope John the 23rd is that when he was Pope, he used to get some insomnia from not being able to sleep, and he eventually learned to pray at the end of the night, okay, it's your church. The Pope is going to bed. And I think that could be a helpful reminder for all of us, especially those of us who want to come to a solution, who want to fix a problem, who want to make the world better, to want to make the church better, to realize we can do our part, we can do our little bit, but at the end of the day, God is the one who's in charge, and we hope that in our little contribution to God's work, we are following God's will and doing our little bit rather than taking over the project. The second point I'd like to make is it's hard to not feel a bit of disappointment here on Moses' behalf. This is this promised land that he's seeing but is never going to enter. This is the famous story that Martin Luther King Jr. also references just before his death when he says, I have seen the promised land. How do we deal with the disappointment, the tension between what we see ahead of us, the reign of God, a reign of justice, a reign of peace, a reign of beauty, a reign of love, and the reality of our own life in what one of our prayers calls this valley of tears? In some ways, we talk about this often in theology, about the tension between the already and the not yet. We are already born again in baptism to be children of God, and yet we recognize how much we don't always live up to the commitments we made at our baptism. We are already see the way in which the world is improved, made better, made more holy, and yet we also see all the ways in which even the church, even the instrument for that holiness, falls short in relationship to what we hope for. We can take this at one level and say, well, our recipe is just to be disappointed here, that there's always going to be a gap and there's nothing we can do about it. What we might do instead is to look at, okay, where do we find the glimpses? Where do we get to see the reign of God happening in the future or in these moments on the mountaintops, that even if we're not fully living in the reign of God, we can still have that faith and hope that does not disappoint in the world that God is bringing about. We can see this at church. Perhaps the liturgy is this foretaste where people who would normally not be together come together and share a meal. And in the sharing of that meal and in the hearing of the story and in the mutual greeting of peace, we are then refreshed to be sent out into the world to keep doing this reign of God stuff. We can see it in other ways. We can see it when people resist attempts to dehumanize migrants, attempts to dehumanize our homeless sisters and brothers, who attempts to say that these people are not human. And we see people, both Christians and Catholics and other people of goodwill, resisting that demonization. That's a moment of glimpsing the reign of God. We see that in big moments of trial and of love, and we often see it more often in the day-to-day small love that we find in families, that we find in our parish, that we find in people who are doing the works of mercy, visiting those in the hospital, providing help to our migrant families, cleaning up with the bulletins at the end of Mass on Sunday. All of those little minutes of love are never lost, and all of those little moments of love are windows into the future full reality of the reign of God. So rather than being bitter that we're not there yet, and without also denying the fact that we've got a long way to go, I think this image of Moses seeing the promised land and still hoping for it, and yet stepping back so that God can step in, might be a moment for us in our own lives today as church to begin to acknowledge both our distance and to look with hope towards the reign of God wherever we find it. So I might invite you to today, where do you see a glimpse from the mountaintop? It might not be a literal mountaintop unless you're on vacation somewhere, but where do you see a glimpse from the mountaintop where the love of God, the beauty of God, and the beauty and justice of God's reign is bursting through, so that even if you're not going to see it in its fullness, you can see it now and you can continue doing your little bit, our little bit, to make it happen.